If you're using your own data set, does that mean you don't need to worry about bias anymore? Unfortunately, you will still have to worry about bias. But well-crafted regulation should just really be there to make sure that systems perform the way that they should. The core question about how to regulate AI, we actually see that China, Europe, the US, the way in which China is regulating AI or the way in which the US is approaching regulation of AI isn't that different. Regulations often don't get into that level of detail. They just say, one way or another, make sure that your data set is representative. One way or another, make sure that your outputs aren't discriminating against these particular groups.
Welcome to the Regulating AI Podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI Podcast, where we explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, ethics, and policy. I'm your host, Sanjay Puri, and today we have an exceptional guest who's been at the forefront of AI ethics and regulation for over a decade. Ansgar Koene currently serves as the global AI ethics and regulatory leader at Ernst & Young and is an expert advisor to the UN Secretary General's high-level body on AI. With extensive experience chairing IEEE's working group on Algorithmic Bias Consideration, and his work with organizations like Five Rights Foundation focusing on children's digital rights, Ansgar brings a unique perspective on building ethical AI systems that serve humanity. Welcome to the show, Ansgar.
Hi, great to be here.
Wonderful. Ansgar, our show is global. It has a global audience of policymakers, think tanks, entrepreneurs, AI aficionado around the world. So for them and for me, I'm curious, your career has spanned from neuroscience to AI ethics. What has inspired this transition, and how does your background in understanding human cognition influence your approach to AI governance?
Sure. So the transition really from doing academic research into computational neuroscience and robotics, it was really on that kind of an intersection between those two that I was working. It led me in around 2016 to start looking more into computational social science, the use of online data for understanding human behavior. And that was really sort of the trigger for me to start moving more into the policy kind of space, because the space around computational social science is fraught with ethical questions around the use of online data for purposes other than the reasons why a person may initially have created the kind of data. It's excellent to be able to use a resource like Twitter to understand human communication, but the people having that initial Twitter communication, they did not think you were going to do that kind of an analysis on. So that really opened up the space of thinking around how are we using this kind of digital information, and how is that also shaping people? So that really led to the follow-on project around bias and recommender systems. And it snowballed from there, looking at bias and recommender systems, getting involved with the IEEE on the standards, the global initiative on ethics of AI, and through that, reaching out to an organization like EY that is there to make sure that business governance around the use of various things, including emerging technologies like AI, is built on a solid foundation, as well as, of course, engaging with policymakers around the kinds of regulatory thinking that needs to be taking place in order to deal with the new kinds of challenges that might come up. So it wasn't a planned transition per se, but it was something that grew out of engagement with the new kinds of challenges that these kinds of technologies bring, the new kinds of issues that we need to be thinking about, like when is it effectively the case of just because we can do a thing, should we be doing that thing? And if we're going to do it, what is the right way to do that? And you asked me around, so how does my experience of working in neuroscience and in robotics actually help me in this kind of space? I think often what people say, what I bring to this conversation, especially in the public policy kind of area, is that I do actually come at it with a background in engineering, with a background in thinking about reinforcement learning. How does this work? Not just in an artificial setting, but actually also in the biological space, where we got our initial sort of ideas about reinforcement learning from. So it means that I come at it with a different kind of understanding of what is possible with these kinds of tools. What are the challenges that exist if you think about translating regulation into implementation of those regulations and those kinds of questions?
Wow. Ansgar, we're going to talk about policy, but I'm just a little fascinated with your background. So I want to just ask you, just as a curiosity, Ernst & Young is, a very typical consulting kind of a firm. When they looked at your incredible background of so many different things, was it something that was an attraction to them, or is it a distraction to an organization like Ernst & Young? This is just my curiosity.
Sure. So the connection between myself and Ernst & Young came actually through the IEEE working group. So I'd taken on board the work to chair the standard on algorithmic bias considerations, and one of the partners from Ernst & Young had joined that standards working group. So that's how we started having conversations, including around possibly giving some workshops at EY about AI ethics. And so that's how we came to identifying the kind of value that my kind of background and what I was doing would bring to EY, and then creating my role of global AI ethics and regulatory leader. And for myself, it was a very interesting proposition at that point in my career, where I was looking to transition from doing the research to doing more of the policy engagement. In that EY, as you say, being in the kind of consulting space as well as in the assurance space, is interestingly positioned to be able to really bring these kinds of recommendations on good practices out of the academic bubble and into the practical application kind of space.
Well, that's great to know, because again, for our listeners, some of them who are charting their path in AI ethics, this is a good message that to have multidisciplinary skills and interest actually is a positive. So, because a lot of people, are looking at your career trajectory and saying, how did he get there? So I think this is very, very helpful. Talking just briefly about E&Y, as the global AI ethics and regulatory leader there, what are some of the most pressing ethical challenges that you see large organizations facing when implementing AI systems? Because E&Y consults with large, organizations. So it would be interesting to hear, as Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies are implementing this. Everybody is talking about responsible AI, trustworthy AI. I would love to get your perspective. What are they dealing with?
I think when you're really looking at the sort of the responsible ethical aspect of the challenges that come of introducing AI, there are many challenges that come in. This is just one of the sets there. But I think a big element of that is around communication. It's really a part of the transparency aspect, which is to say, making sure that the various parties who will be impacted by the introduction of the AI system, be it employees internally because of the way it's going to change the work that they're doing, or be it the people that are receiving the services that you are performing by using AI, that they need to understand to a sufficient amount how you are using AI in the service so that they can bring to you the challenge where necessary as to, is the system actually performing the way it should? Because maybe you don't have the right kind of data that you're using in this kind of process, or maybe the system, because inherently AI, of course, is finding patterns in historical data to extrapolate to the future, but perhaps the future is not a straight extrapolation of the current. Something has changed. Are you taking that into account in the right way? And it's both the frontline staff that have been performing these services and, of course, those who will be receiving the outputs that are best placed in order to flag where these challenges are. But they can only do that if you're sufficiently transparent with them as to what is happening behind the scenes. And of course, the other area where ethics really comes to the fore is around the question of, because AI has made it possible to do this, should you be doing it? I mean, this is where there's a lot of concern, especially from labor unions, for instance, around, because with AI in the mix, you can potentially monitor your employees to much greater detail, etc. But is that something that you should be doing? I mean, what kind of a signal are you sending to your employees by doing that? Or is that really going to be to the net benefit? So these are some of the issues. There's, of course, all kinds of questions touching also on things like data privacy and bias. I mean, how have you managed to make sure that the system is going to differentiate its outputs truly on the basis of those kinds of features that should be relevant to the task, and not making kind of distinctions based on factors that shouldn't be relevant? The classical one being, of course, concerns around gender or race. But the real issue with the bias question is that you can't just give a singular kind of, we've now unbiased the system. It's always going to be very context specific, and you really need to understand what is the decision that needs to be made here, and what are the truly relevant factors that come into play. So that's where a big challenge is, if you, especially with the new kinds of AI systems that are much closer to a plug and play. They're not really plug and play, but they're closer to it. You can take an off-the-shelf AI system to try to feed it data to do something, but have you sufficiently understood the problem that you're training it to in order to make it possible for you to assess whether the system is biased? So there's, quite a broad spectrum of areas where ethics and responsibility come into play. But at the core, really, it's making sure that you're being a responsible actor when you're using AI, same as you had to be a responsible actor in all kinds of other ways in which your organization is working.
So you have unpacked a lot of things in there, which has kind of raised a bunch of questions to me. So before I forget, as I'm growing older, I forget, I'm going to just shoot out the question and then you can address. One aspect is, as you said, these companies, you emphasize communication as being one of the key tenets of doing this. Do you think these companies, a lot of them are setting up ethics boards, maybe E&Y even helps in some of those things. One aspect is, should ethics boards be made up just of internal folks? Because when I talk to chief AI officers, most of these Fortune 500 companies, it's all internal. Maybe it's across different folks. Should there be an external and an internal component? That's question one. Second is innovation getting held up? Because when I talk to a lot of chief AI officers, I ask them what keeps you up at night, and they say governance and policy is definitely one thing. Is innovation getting held up? And final question is, because you kind of address this, is a lot of companies, including some of your clients, are now creating custom LLMs based on their proprietary data. And this is a curiosity and also a question that came up from the audience is, when you create these custom LLMs, is bias still going to be an element in there? Because now this is let's just say I'm a law firm and I've taken all my 20 years of cases. Is bias still going to be part of that? It's really, I don't know the answer. So I have given you three questions. Let's see if you can remember them, or at least maybe you can answer some of them.
Sure. So I'll start with the last one. If you're using your own data set, does that mean you don't need to worry about bias anymore? Unfortunately, you will still have to worry about bias. I mean, for starters, it's going to learn to reproduce the type of pattern of outputs that you've produced in the past. How sure are you that you haven't been biased in the past? That's one of the areas where we've been seeing bias occurring in automated decision-making systems, where it's effectively identified patterns in your past behavior. The classical case is recruitment algorithms, where if traditionally it ended up being mostly men that got recruited or men that got promoted to high positions, the AI system is likely to pick up on that pattern and may then inherently make maleness one of the factors that suggests that this is a good hire. That's not what you wanted. So you're definitely going to have to think about this. So you need to always critically ask, is this data set really the one that we need to be having? Is it complete? We're going to have minority groups within that. How do we make sure that we can balance out the way in which it performs for those? And you need to challenge yourself. If I give it test cases, can I see that it is only differentially giving outputs in those cases where it should be making a differential output? Just test it by having two identical candidates where you've only changed the gender, those kinds of questions. The other questions that you posed were around, sorry, I forgot.
One was on the ethics board.
Yes, the ethics
should
board,
there
yes,
be
okay.
internal, external?
Yeah.
That was basically a question.
Yeah. This is going to be a recurring thing, but it's context. It depends on the context. If the performance, the kind of service that you're providing with this AI system is going to be something that really has a significant impact on certain external groups, then I think there is a strong case to be made that you need to have a process for engaging those external groups. Now, whether that means that you need to have a representative of that external group on an ethics board, or whether that means you use a different kind of process, that will depend, but there needs to be a way to make sure that the concerns of that external group are raised and can be addressed appropriately. So it may very well be beneficial to have external representatives there. On the other hand, for many uses of AI systems, practically, I mean, if we're talking about an AI system to help with your supply chain management or something like that, you probably don't necessarily need to have external people on your ethics board. The ethics questions will, in that case, be more around how you're managing your internal people and those kinds of questions. So the board needs to have the relevant expertise to address the kind of questions that are going to arise in the types of use cases that you're using AI for. I think the other most important point is the AI ethics board should not live in its own bubble. It needs to be connected to your overall ethical organization thinking. It needs to be integrated into the broader thinking of how are we a responsible organization.
Final, and then I thought of another question. Sorry, because you're coming up with some incredible insights. It can be a brief answer. Do you find organizations kind of slowing down implementations because of concerns about ethics, policy, regulation? Or should they?
They should slow down their implementation if they are finding that they're struggling with meeting the sort of the core concerns. I think we are seeing some organizations slowing down the rollout of AI systems because of concerns around compliance with new regulation. However, the biggest thing that is slowing down organizations in their process from having done a proof of concept into an actual deployment of a system is usually not specific to regulatory compliance or to ethics questions, but rather to quality control. How do we make sure that the system is going to be robust and reliable when it is being deployed at scale with data that is now potentially a bit more messy and where the circumstances can drift more than they did in the proof of concept kind of situation? I mean, ultimately, well-crafted regulation, and that's going to be in perhaps part of our discussion, when is regulation well-crafted and when not, but well-crafted regulation should just really be there to make sure that systems perform the way that they should. So, you don't, as an organization, you don't want your system to fail. You want your system to perform, have good quality. What regulation does is it clarifies a standard of what is good quality. It brings to the fore certain concerns about how systems might have a negative impact on society, perhaps more broadly, but those are kinds of negative externalities that you really wanted to avoid anyway, because even if there wasn't a regulatory consequence, there would certainly be a reputational consequence if the system failed in that way. So I don't really see regulation and similarly ethics. I don't really see that as a primary thing that slows down deployment for actors who are thinking long term, that they want to be in this game with a good reputation in the long term. But the challenge is often getting it clearly specified in a way that you really understand what is and what isn't good. How do we assess whether we are living up to these requirements sufficiently? How do we operationalize our quality assessment?
I promise this will be my last question on this topic, but a lot of chief AI officers, when I talk to them, they say there are hundreds, in some cases with large companies, thousands of use cases that they have to figure out. Should ethics be a consideration in finalizing which use case they should be going for, Ansgar? This is to the chief AI officers who are listening to you right now.
It should certainly be part of the consideration. I mean, I would hope that we're all looking to be a good actor in society, and ethics is really about that. It's making sure that the way in which we engage with our internal people, with our external stakeholders, with our customers, is as a good actor that all parties will want to continue to engage with. And as such, ethics should be an important aspect of the way in which you assess whether this is a domain where AI is appropriate to use, and whether or not this particular AI system is the appropriate one to use, and how far to go with the type of automation versus, and where to make sure that there is still space for people to raise, if they think the system isn't performing correctly, to get a human on the line to speak to if they really can't figure out how to get this AI system to do what is needed.
Okay, so ethics should definitely be a consideration when picking up this. Moving on, Ansgar, you've been currently advising the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory body on AI. What global challenges do you see in terms of creating a unified AI governance framework or harmonizing of some of these regulations? Because Ernst & Young is a global company. You deal with companies that have global footprints. Now, they have to deal with the EU AI Act, they have to deal in the United States with, we don't have comprehensive regulation. It might be in California, it might be different states, etc. Then there is, it could be different places in Africa, China, India, etc. What are your thoughts on that?
I think with any kind of attempt to create comprehensive or certainly closely aligned approaches to regulation at a global kind of scale, a core challenge is just that so many of the different jurisdictions are at a different place in how they are engaging with and using these technologies. I mean, we've got, for instance, the OECD countries in the West that are highly industrialized and who are also key players in the creation of these types of technologies. Their interests and also the way in which they're going to use these technologies is somewhat different from the global majority countries that are more of a consumer of these technologies. They are not, this is not where these main technology companies are based. Who are probably going to use this technology for different kind of purposes than the highly industrialized countries are going to do. And then how are you going to bring those different interests together into a single unified approach of regulating, or at least setting key principles of regulation? That's always the big challenge. And that's also why we end up with at the UN level generally going towards guidelines as opposed to regulations, and that the language tends to become more vague because it needs to be able to be open to interpretations to meet the different kinds of sort of local context. So this is, of course, why this way of working is often open to criticism. It's people say, what's the point of this? But I think there is a real valid point to it, because it does help, first of all, raise awareness amongst the different players as to what the issues are at play with other parties. It does provide, even if it's vaguely formulated, a core baseline to work against, which is effectively, for instance, the AI principles that were adopted by the G20. Developed by OECD initially, adopted by the G20, effectively the global standard. They are somewhat vague. They talk about human-centeredness, they talk about transparency, but what exactly do we mean with human-centeredness? Those kinds of things. But they do provide a baseline from which national AI strategies and national approaches then are being built. And because of that common baseline, we have a better chance of getting to, if not alignment, at least compatibility between the different approaches to doing regulation on this new technology.
So they're providing a baseline to do that. Two questions that come out of it. Hopefully I'll remember. AI has become a geopolitical issue, so to speak. How, and I'm looking at it from a company standpoint, companies just want to, sell their product or their service, etc. How does that discussion from a framework or suggestion, etc., impact that? The other question is that what role do you see? I mean, you talked about IEEE in your work there. What role does organizations like IEEE and CENELEC play in a discussion around, let's say, the policy or AI governance? So two quick questions on that.
So the geopolitical aspect obviously complicates matters. It makes it more difficult to for the different parties to speak openly around the issues. But if we look at sort of the core question about how to regulate AI, we actually see that China, Europe, the US, they see the same kind of problems. They see the same kind of things that need to be done to make sure that their own populations can engage with these technologies in a safe and a confident way. So, the way in which China is regulating AI, or the way in which the US is approaching regulation of AI isn't that different. But what you do see is that the geopolitics gets used as a tool to argue for you shouldn't be regulating us now because that will stifle our ability to compete with the others. And of course, what happens in the national security space is always somewhat of a matter of its own. If you look at the EU AI Act, national security and defense is not covered by the AI Act. It is not part of the competency of the EU. It's in national member state competency. So that is always a space on its own. But it definitely gets in the way to a certain extent of a free and open dialogue and information exchange. But the national sort of the Bletchley and Seoul dialogues around AI safety were open. China participated in that. But we are seeing, that the common interest does trump geopolitics when it comes to the question of how do we regulate AI. It doesn't necessarily trump politics when it comes to other aspects around AI, like how to invest and how to make sure that you're the front runner in creating this technology. So what is the role of organizations like the IEEE, ISO, IEC, Senelec, all of these standards development bodies? Standards development plays an important role in this space because it's really the kind of bridge between regulations, which talk about the types of outcomes that you want to be seeing, and implementation. What do we actually need to do in order to get to those kinds of outcomes? Because especially in this technology space with emerging technologies, regulations often don't get into that level of detail. They just say, one way or another, make sure that your data set is representative. One way or another, make sure that your outputs aren't discriminating against these particular groups. So how do I translate that into what I actually need to do as an organization? That's where standards come into play. They're effectively where industry, but also academia and civil society experts can come together and really formulate what does best practice look like. And this is a challenging process. And for something like the EU AI Act, the fact that the legislation was passed and within 2 years, companies are going to have to be compliant with the obligations for high risk is a big problem for the standards development, because that means we've got less than 2 years, more like 1.5 years, to create the standards. And the standard it's finding what is best practice. It means experts need to come together and need to have the space to do consensus forming. And doing that on a short timeline is not really the best thing to do, but it's where we are and it's what we need to be doing. So it's all hands on deck to try and get that done.
So obviously, the role of standards becomes very important. What about the role of third-party auditing and certification organizations for enforcing some of these standards? Do you think there is a role for them?
Absolutely. It's still early stages. There are still a lot of questions around what does good third-party assessment look like. We need standards to assess against. We need also clarity when a regulator says we want you to do a bias audit of these AI systems. Do they mean auditing the process, or do they mean auditing the actual outputs? And how are we going to, what level of assurance are we going to give? How long is that supposed to be? The confidence that a user is going to get from the fact that this has been assured, or how long should they be able to go with that? And when do you need to do a reassurance because of drift? These are all questions that are still open. And certainly in the policy space, there is a tendency to use the language in an imprecise way: audit versus assurance versus certification versus third-party verification. Get used in a somewhat interchangeable way, which is somewhat frustrating for people in the assurance industry.
Mm-hmm.
But it is, I think, going to become an important contributor to being able to let people and businesses that are looking to purchase these kinds of technologies, or businesses that are looking to do business with other businesses, to be able to get a signal. Is this a trustworthy partner to be engaging in? And that's not just in terms of compliance with regulation, but it's also in terms of robustness of the system, in terms of to what extent the system has been assessed in its performance quality. So I think it's going to become an important contributor, but it is still at a nascent stage. Financial audit has had decades, century of development to get to where it is currently, and there's still plenty of criticisms as to the whether it lives up to what people expect from it. Assurance on AI systems is going to need some time to really get to where it delivers what people want. And part of that is that there needs to be clarity on expectations. What should you be expecting from this kind of an assessment? If we're doing an assurance on the process, that you have a risk management process in place, that you have a data governance process in place, if that's what's being assured, that means you've got fundamentally a good operation going, but that is not going to guarantee that you won't have the occasional failure of the system. Recognizing what it is that is or isn't being assessed and assured and so forth is going to be an important element to expectation management in this space. And if we don't have that, we'll get a lot of people very disappointed with the kind of results that they're getting from this. They'll say, this system failed on me, even though certain provider did a certification of that system, and that's because there was a misunderstanding as to what the certification actually certified, etc. And that those kinds of misunderstandings could lead to real difficulties for this ecosystem to grow if people basically don't trust the outcomes of an assurance. So that's why we need, at this point in time, to really be crystallizing what do we mean with different types of verification? What are the standards against which we are doing the verification? How do we assess the quality of the assurance provider? What kind of accreditation or other ways of certifying the assessors need to be in place?
So there is a role, but it needs to be well thought through. As you said, financial auditing took us decades, maybe centuries, and still, as we know what happened with Enron and other stuff, we still have those questions that come up. As you said, the quality of assessors, what are we verifying? Those things need to. So it's going to be an evolutionary process, is what you're saying, Ansgar, to our audience, right?
Yeah.
Coming to this issue, Ansgar, I have a lot of policymakers that come in, and let's just take the EU AI Act, which you're very familiar with. It's now this body of rules, regulations, policies that's been set up. Now, obviously, it started way before ChatGPT and others came in, and they had to kind of rework LLMs in there. Now, if there is, let's say 6 months from now, some transformational technology within this whole sphere, and the likelihood is pretty high because you've got multimodal, you've got agents and things of that nature. How does policy keep up with this? Because the speed of innovation here is unlike, I've spent all my life in technology, and you obviously have a much better window. It's unlike anything I've seen. And I ask this to lawmakers all the time. In the US, they have a very different perspective because they say we're going to do incremental legislation. We're not going to do comprehensive legislation. Your thoughts on keeping policy in touch with the speed of innovation?
Sure. I mean, this is always challenging, but I think you're right. It's especially challenging in a space like AI, where things have been moving so very fast. The first approach, of course, in policymaking is always to say we're not going to give specific rules as to particular technology aspects, but rather we're focusing on the outcomes on people. And basically the regulator says, if you are going to harm people's fundamental rights, or you cause physical harm to a person, that is something that is not allowed. So you need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And the regulation doesn't really specify anything beyond that. It's up to you as an organization to make sure those outcomes don't occur. So that's one way in which the regulation tries to avoid getting too much pinned down on a particular state of technology. However, as we saw with the AI Act, a shift from AI systems that are very purpose-built to more general purpose kind of AI had a significant impact on the fundamentals of how the regulation was framed around assessment of the risks of the particular use case. So that meant a new piece needed to be bolted on. Something of that nature could occur again if it is not too dramatic of a change. There is some scope for the AI office. So that's the part of the European Commission that is primarily focused on the implementation of the AI Act. For the AI office to potentially put out some secondary legislation to amend what exists, which would be a faster process. But if the change is too big, it would probably not fit within this kind of mold at all, and new legislation would be necessary, which goes through its process, that usually a multi-year kind of process. Would the EU be in a more difficult position there than, say, the US? Maybe not. I mean, the US also, with their piecemeal approach, would, for a new situation, also have to pass a new piece. So they'd sort of be in a similar kind of position there. So the regulators have tried to think about this. They've tried to build the system in a flexible way. The list of applications of AI that would make it a high risk case, so the kind of case where most of the regulatory obligations come into play, is as an annex to the regulation that makes it easier to be updated as well. So, those kinds of things have been put in play. Perhaps, and we'll have to see how well it works, perhaps one of the most important aspects is actually the fact that you have a centralized organization like the AI office, which is supported by a scientific board and an advisory board. So you've got academia scientists looking at where's AI going to provide input to the AI office, but you've also got an advisory board that has representation from industry and from civil society to also flag when things are changing in a way that might need adaptation of the regulatory approach. But the big challenge is around the whole implementation of the AI Act. A piece of legislation is just a piece of paper until it gets implemented, and the implementation depends on so many things beyond the piece of paper. It depends on having the right people that actually have the skills to be able to deliver on this. It depends on the interplay between, in the case of the EU, the centralized work at the European Commission, but also then the work at the authorities, the national authorities at the different member states. Is that going to work nicely? A lot of the challenges and concerns that people have had around GDPR implementation has been about that different national authorities are implementing it slightly differently and those kinds of things. So, and a big one in the AI Act is around the regulatory sandboxes. It's supposed to be a key tool to make it easier for SMEs to become compliant. I mean, small, medium enterprises, they can't have the same kind of compliance teams that large organizations have. So they need support for this. Every country has to have or has to participate in a regulatory sandbox to help these. But at the moment, none of these is really running yet. Where are they going to get the expertise in order to do this? it's a question mark. Again, I think this is an area where it's mutual learning. While companies are learning how to do their compliance, the regulatory authorities, the oversight bodies, are learning how to do the oversight as well. And we will need some time to really get into a stable state of this is what good compliance looks like, and this is what good oversight looks like.
We need to get to a stable state, as you said, and it's going to take some time. And as you said, if it is not a major transformative innovation, the regulations might be able to handle it. Otherwise, they might have to come up with something different. And you're right, in the US, we have to do that. It gets much harder in the US right now. We have a very complicated political system. I was in Europe about 2 weeks ago, and one of the questions, and you're in Brussels, I just want just a very brief thing, and I talked to a lot of policymakers too, and entrepreneurs. And there is this whole concern, Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Bank, he came up with this whole thing that we need to change things in Europe. And again, so I've had many interactions with folks. What is your view on this? Because some of the entrepreneurs I met, they have some amazing ideas, but they are coming over to the US for funding and setting their businesses here, which is good, but maybe not as good for the European ecosystem, is what I'm thinking. So just some quick thoughts on that, Ansgar.
Sure. I mean, this has been a concern for Europe now for many years, that Europe has a good ecosystem when it comes to education. People get their training, and then they get to the point of having ideas as to how to create new innovative businesses. But then far too frequently, from a European point of view, they move to other locations, be it the US, but also sometimes to Asia, to run their business. There are many drivers for that, and actually only very few of those have to do with technology regulation. Many more are related to the challenges of even starting a business. It depends on which member state you're in. A former colleague of mine has been launching a robotics related company in Germany, and he was saying so many people advised him to just go to the US. You could have had your company up and running already instead of all of this bureaucracy. But he's been insisting, because the original research was funded from European research funding. But it's often more that kind of basic business, how to run a business, that is stifling the ability to start up in Europe. I think there are efforts to try to make that easier, but they still have a long way to go. But the next stage is even when companies, the startup phase is done in Europe, they may still move outside of Europe when they go into the growth phase because of the challenges of attracting the right kind of funding. And that's another area where Europe still has a lot of work to do. And there are initiatives around that. I was just reading today about a new way of registering your company at the European level instead of at the member state level, and attempts to simplify things through that route. We'll have to see if that works. But certainly the biggest challenges that are driving companies away from Europe at the moment are most frequently not to do with technology regulation. There will be instances where that is the case, but are to do with other kinds of red tape.
Okay. And I hope that improves, because the talent I saw was there in huge spades. I mean, look at some of the top AI experts, the gurus of the AI godfathers. Well, most of them are actually from Europe, if you really think about it. They might not be in Europe anymore, but they are originally from Europe. But Ansgar, this has been fantastic. At the end, we have a lightning round, just a little to not to put you on the spot, to just get some concise answers. We've had good form discussions. So are you ready for that?
Go for it.
Okay, one word answers, Ansgar, innovation or regulation?
One word answer. I'm sorry, I can't give you that because I think it has to be both.
Okay, we'll make an exception for you. Future of AI, is it bright or is it concerning?
Uh, mm, it's a bit of both, but I think there are. It's fairly bright.
Okay, good. We like the bright aspect. Open source or proprietary AI?
Depends on the use case. I am a fan of open source, so I'll go with open source.
Okay. What is more important, data or algorithms?
I'll go with algorithms.
All right. Okay, finally, for our global audience, based on your extensive experience, one concrete action that organizations can take to improve their AI governance, if you were to give them one actionable advice.
Strong support from the top.
Get support from the top. Great advice, great advice. Ansgar, thank you really for joining us. Your insights from working across so many different sectors, as I talked about, global corporations, international organizations, academia. You've given us some very valuable perspective on how we can, develop AI governance frameworks that are both effective as well as inclusive. And to our listeners, remember that shaping the future of AI requires active participation from all stakeholders, as Ansgar pointed out. And please don't forget to subscribe and share this episode with others interested in the future of AI policy, governance, and regulation. Thank you very much, Ansgar, and thank you to our listeners. This has been fantastic.
Thank you.